Well, it's the week after Easter. The great celebration that Jesus has risen from the dead has arrived and gone, and now we can find ourselves feeling a little bit like the early church going, well, now what? What do we do now? What does this mean for us? And what does this change? And what the apostles found out is that, well, Jesus rising from the dead changes everything. And it brought about great change and transition for the apostles. And even though it was a good thing, it's the most amazing thing ever, those changes and those transitions caused fear for the apostles. You know, the week after Jesus rises from the dead, they're still hiding out. They're not going out and being courageous and bold and sharing the gospel with people. They're actually still hiding. And even after Jesus spends 40 days with them after his resurrection and then ascends into heaven, you know what they do? They hide in a house again. And it takes the Holy Spirit coming upon Pentecost to kind of boot them out and get them going. But it makes me think that we're not that different. That Easter is this wonderful celebration. Jesus has risen from the dead, and wow, isn't that amazing? But I still can be filled with fear. I can still have a little trepidation in my heart when it comes to changes and transitions. And I was thinking, we find ourselves in the middle of a massive change, both in our lives and in our country and in the world. There's massive shifts and changes and transitions happening. And it's really easy to be filled with fear and anxiety over all the uncertainty and all the unknowns that change can bring. Because sometimes even when change is good, even when we're excited about it, it's something new that we've been looking forward, and we're finally there. Oh, never mind. This is too much. I just let me get things back to normal again. Never mind. I don't want that much change. I don't want that transition. Have you ever felt that way? I think we all have, right? That even when change feels good, even when it's an exciting change like the apostles and Jesus rising from the dead, there's still fear when normal changes, when our routines shift. And there's still fear and anxiety when we know the future is going to be different than the way we expected it to be. And so what I want to do in the coming weeks is look at the life of Joshua. Joshua is this amazing example of faith and obedience to God in the middle of change and transition. His whole life is pretty much one of transition because he's part of the generation that grew up as slaves in Egypt, went through the Red Sea crossing and the plagues and the wilderness wanderings. He's the one that saw them go into the promised land and go through the conquest and things like the story of Jericho's walls falling down. Joshua goes through it all. And if you want to talk about changes and transitions, his whole life is wrapped up in changes and transitions. And I want to look at his life because we're in the middle of change and transition, and it can be scary. I know for myself, I get overwhelmed at times when I think about the future and what's coming next and that all that uncertainty that comes with it. And Joshua becomes this wonderful example of obedience and faithfulness to God because Joshua helps us realize that even when we're going through changes and transitions, some good, some bad, some wonderful, some incredibly difficult and painful, that God is faithful and is with his people every step of the way. So I want to begin with a verse from Jesus. Before we get to Joshua, I want to start with Jesus. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is having a conversation with a group of people, and his apostles hear the teaching, and Peter speaks up and is astonished and asks, well, who could be saved? Like, what you just said, Jesus, sounds impossible. So who can pull it off? And Jesus looks at Peter and the apostles and the crowd that had gathered. He says this, with man it is impossible, but not with God, because all things are possible with God. You know, one of the things that I think would be so helpful for you during all this time of change, during this time of uncertainty and all these unknowns about the future, is to write that verse down. To memorize that verse. If you've never memorized Bible verses, this would be a great time to start. To put those words of God's promises into your heart and your mind and in your home, and be reminded every single day of Jesus' words. Because the reality is, you and I right now are going to face times, and we're going to face moments and days where things feel impossible. When things feel too much, too difficult, too hard. And we're going to need that reminder that Jesus tells us, hey, it feels impossible. It feels too hard and too difficult for you. But don't worry, because it's not too hard for God. All things are possible with God. And see, during this time that we're facing, that we're living in, I think we need that promise and that reminder every day that nothing's too hard or too difficult for God. And so as we look at the life of Joshua, I invite you to grab a Bible. If you have to pause this worship service for a moment to grab one and get one in front of you, that's okay. But we're going to start in Numbers chapter 13. And in Numbers chapter 13, what we find is that God calls Moses and the people of Israel, and he commands Moses, because they're essentially on the border of the promised land. They've been going through the wilderness for a little while, and now they're on the border of entering the promised land. So God calls Moses to him and tells him, Moses, I want you to pick 12 men, basically guys that would make good soldiers, good military warriors and leaders, and pick one from each tribe, and then you're going to send these 12 men into the promised land, and they're going to scout it out. And so Moses does this, and they spend 40 days there. And when they get there, they're amazed. It's a beautiful, fertile land. It's everything you could ever hope for and imagine. And so as they explore it, they're amazed at it, and they're blown away by its beauty. And then they see all the people that live there. And they see they have fortified cities that would be hard to conquer. They have great, big, strong warriors that the Bible kind of describes as giants. And descendants of great heroes and military conquerors. And so when they come back after these 40 days, they come to give a report to Moses and Aaron and everybody. And they stand before Moses and Aaron and all the people, and they tell them what they saw. And they start off with the good news. And it says this in Numbers chapter 13, starting in verse 26. They brought back a report for them and the whole community, and they showed them the fruit of the land. They reported to Moses, we went into the land where you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey, and here is some of its fruit. And so they come back and they show them, here's what we found. It's a beautiful land. It's flowing with milk and honey, which is kind of a poetic way of saying it's luscious, it's fertile, it's a great piece of land. We definitely want to live there. And then they even say, here's some of its fruit. And it's interesting early in Numbers 13 that when they were collecting the fruit while they were there on their mission, it describes it as they had to have 2 men carry the fruit because it was so great. And so this is a wonderful report. They come back and say, it's flowing with milk and honey. It's everything we ever hoped for. What they're really saying is this. It's everything God promised. Because that's why this is called the promised land. God had promised it to his people long ago. And he had told them it's going to be flowing with milk and honey. It's going to be great for you. And when they get there, they see God has kept his promise. But, and there's always a but, right? Whenever you hear really, really great news, right? That's the way of saying, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And that's what's going to happen next. And so it goes on in verse 28. They say, however, right? It's flowing with milk and honey. It's wonderful. Here's the great fruit we found from it. However, the people living in the land are strong, and the cities are large and fortified. We also saw the descendants of Anak there, and they go on and they describe the type of people they see there, and essentially what they're saying is they're really great warriors. And we're not. In fact, at the end of chapter 13, they say this, to ourselves, or in our own eyes, we seemed like grasshoppers, and we must have seemed the same to them. So what you have is this report of, hey, this thing that we're about to enter is wonderful. God has kept his promise. It's exactly like he said it would be. We just can't go there. We can't conquer it. We can't do it. We're not strong enough. We're not big enough. We're not mighty enough. This is too hard. It's too difficult. Right? When they say we seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes and their eyes, what they're saying is, compared to these mighty warriors, we seem like little bugs just to be squashed. It's impossible. Now, while this report is going on, 10 of them are saying this. 10 of them are saying, we can't do it. We are not strong enough. It's too hard. It's too difficult. We can't handle this change. We can't handle this transition. We can't do it. And then you have 2 of them, Caleb and Joshua, saying, but God can. In fact, in the middle of it, in the middle of this negative report, in verse 30 it says this, Caleb quieted the people in the presence of Moses and said, let us go up now. You see the boldness and faithfulness of Caleb, and we know later on that Joshua is standing with him. And so you essentially see these 2 guys standing in the middle of everybody, where everybody is saying, it's impossible, we can't do it. And you see Caleb and his boldness and his courage and his faithfulness to God, that he and Joshua are essentially saying, let's go up now. Not let's put it off. Let's think about it. Not let's be cautious. Not let's ponder it and we'll take it up at the next meeting. But let's go now. What amazing boldness and courage. And take possession of the land, because we can certainly conquer it. Right? Well, you have 10 saying, we can't do it. It's impossible. You have 2, Caleb and Joshua, saying, we can do this. Now here's the question. Why are 10 saying we can't do it, and why are 2 saying we can do it? Why are 10 saying this transition, this change is too scary, it's too difficult and too hard? Let's just go back to the way things were. Right? There's later on in Numbers 14, in fact, what they're going to do as the people of Israel, they're going to say, let's go back to Egypt. Let's go back to that place where we were slaves and we asked God to rescue us. Now we want to go back there, because at least back there we knew what to expect. See, isn't that one of the hard things of change and transition, right? Is not knowing what to expect, not knowing what it's going to look like. See, for the people of Israel going into the promised land, they don't know how the battles are going to go. They don't know what's going to happen. They don't know exactly how it's all going to work out. And so the 10 convince everybody, based on all that fear and all that uncertainty and all that anxiety about change and transition, to let's just go back to the way things were. Let's just go back to Egypt, because it was at least under our control. At least I understood it. Yeah, it had its problems, and not everything was perfect. But hey, we knew what it was like back there. And then you have the 2 over here saying, we can conquer it. Let's go now. So I want to point out 3 things that I think would help us have the faith of Joshua and Caleb during times of transition and change, times of uncertainty and difficulty. Because we don't want to be, as followers of Jesus, like the 10 and say, we can't move forward. We can't keep following God. It's too hard. It's too difficult. Let's just go back to where it's safe, or at least feel safe. We want to have the faith and the courage and the boldness of Joshua and Caleb to be obedient to God, to be faithful to God no matter what. And so the first thing is this: remembering that God led them here. That God is the one that brought them to this moment. Because just think about it. Who rescued them from Egypt? Well, it was God. Who led them through the wilderness when they thought they were done for? You want to talk about a difficult transition and change? Wandering around in the wilderness, wondering, where's our next meal going to come from? Right? When are we going to get there? When is this difficulty going to be over with? And who led them through that? Who saw them through that change and transition? It was God. And now who has brought them through all the ups and downs, through all the changes and transitions to the border of the promised land? God has brought them here. And so for you and I, one of the ways that we can grow in our faith and one of the ways that we can continue to follow Jesus into the future, even if we don't know what it looks like, is that we can remember each day, God has brought us here. God has led us here. Right? In the book of Acts, we were reminded that God determines the places and boundaries of people. He determines when and where we live. And so God has brought you and I here. And that's one of the ways that we can remain faithful and obedient and courageous in our faith. That's one of the ways we can keep following Jesus step by step, day by day, even in times of transition and change, even in difficult and uncertain times, is remembering He has brought us here. Which means He's going to keep being with us there. Right? One of the final promises that Jesus makes before His ascension into heaven, after His resurrection, is, I'm going to be with you always. So He has brought us here, which means He's going to be with us there. The second thing to keep in mind is this: God is the one that told them to go into the promised land. You know, when the spies or the soldiers come back with the report, one of the things they say is, hey, Moses, we went where you told us. And well, yeah, Moses had given them the command. What had really happened earlier in Numbers 13 is that God is the one that told Moses to pick them, and God is the one that told them to go. And so it wasn't Moses' idea. It wasn't Moses' plan. It was God's plan. Meaning God is in control of it. And because if it's God's plan, He's the one that's going to oversee it. He's the one that's going to run it. He's the one that's going to make sure it happens. He's the one that's going to be in control of every step of the way. So one of the ways that you and I can remain faithful and be comforted by God in the midst of uncertainty and change and transition is trusting that God is in control. That He is the one that is leading us and guiding us. He's the one that told them to go into the promised land. He's the one that's going to tell us, keep going. Keep taking the next step. Keep finding ways to share the gospel of Jesus with people in your life. Keep finding ways to love and serve people, even if it looks different, because I guarantee you the promised land looks different than the wilderness. The promised land looks different and is different than Egypt. And yet God is telling His people, I want you to go through this change. I want you to go through this transition. And because it's God's plan, we know that He's in control. So we don't have to worry about what's going to happen next. You know, how is this going to work out? Is it going to work out? Well, we can respond in faith like Joshua and Caleb. We can respond with courage and obedience because we know, yes, it will, because God is in control of this plan. God is in control of leading us and guiding us. The third thing to keep in mind is this: sometimes we need to look back to move forward. And here's what I mean by this. You have the 10 saying, It's impossible. We look like grasshoppers compared to them. They're just going to squish us like bugs. We have no chance. And then you have the two saying, no, we can do it. We can conquer it. Now, why are some saying, let's just go back to Egypt, and then two saying, let's move forward. We can do it. Well, I think it's because Joshua had been mentored and brought up in leadership under Moses. And throughout Moses' ministry, in terms of leading the people of Israel through the Exodus and through the wilderness and up to the promised land, he continually reminded them of God's promises. So going all the way back to Genesis 12, God promises Abraham, I'm going to give you this land. He brought Abraham to the promise and he said, I'm going to give you this land to your descendants in the future. And so that began the promise, the covenant between God and the people of Israel. God telling Abraham, your descendants are going to possess this land because I'm the one that's going to bring them there. I'm the one that's going to give it to them. And so we need to remember God's promises, that he brought them to the promised land because he was keeping his promise. He was keeping his promise to them to be with them, to provide for them, to care for them. Right? Even when the spies go into the land and they see that it's flowing with milk and honey, they come back and say, it's just like God said. Right? God was giving them reminders. I am a God who keeps my promises. And then what's really interesting about this promise and what's really beautiful about it is that every single generation, God essentially renews it. It reminds them. Every time Abraham's going through a transition, he reminds them, like, don't worry, I have this promise for you. Every time Isaac goes through a change and transition, faces difficulty in his life, God says, don't worry, I'm going to keep this promise to you. And then Jacob goes through incredible amounts of changes and transitions. Some of them great, some of them really bad and painful and difficult and hard and overwhelming. And through it all, each time God reminds him, don't worry, I'm going to keep my promise to you. And in fact, the story of Exodus begins with God hearing his people crying out in a time of need and saying, I'm going to bring them out of Egypt and into the promised land. And so God reminds his people time and time again, every single generation, I'm a God who keeps my promises. And so what Moses does throughout their time together as they're wandering from Egypt to the promised land is he reminds his people that whenever they're feeling overwhelmed, whenever they're facing difficulties of change and transitions, don't worry, God keeps his promises. And so one of the things that you and I can do to find comfort during this time and to find a faith of obedience and courage to keep following God through all the changes and transitions we find ourselves in is by looking back at God's faithfulness to each and every single generation. That each generation God renews his promises, reminds his people, I am with you. I'm a God who keeps my promises. But one of the things that Jesus promises us is to be with us always. And it can feel difficult right now. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of things weighing on our hearts and minds. But we need to remember these promises. That God has brought us here. God is in control. And God is faithful. He is always renewing his promises. Jesus makes the promise, I'm going to be with you always. Jesus reminds us, when you get to those moments and they just feel overwhelming and incredibly impossible, and you just say, we can't do it, I feel like a grasshopper, I'm just going to get squashed. He says, yeah, it's impossible for you. But it's not impossible for God. All things are possible for him. So my encouragement and my hope and prayer for you and for our church is that during this time of change and transition, that we would continue to be faithful and bold and courageous in sharing the gospel, coming up with new ways to do that, thinking of ways we never thought of before and say, well, here's a way we can share the gospel of Jesus with people in my life. Here's a way we can share the gospel with people all over the world. that we would be bold and courageous in our faith to find ways to continue loving and serving people, whether they're people that are members of our church or they're outside of our congregation, whatever it may be, that we'd say, this is a way we can love and serve people now. This is a way we can remind them through our acts of kindness and generosity to say, see, God cares for you. We are showing you that God loves you. And that we would be able to do this because we, like Joshua and Caleb, are remembering that God has led us here. So he's going to lead us there. We are remembering that God is in control. And it's all part of his plan, that he knows what's going to happen next, even if we don't. So one of the things I have to remind myself with that is that even if I don't know the what, I don't know what the date is, what the next step is, or what things are going to look like, I do know the who that is going to be with me. I don't know the what, but I know the who. That Jesus is going to be with me, guiding me every step of the way. And lastly, that we be a people that remember God is faithful. He keeps his promises from generation to generation. And so whenever you're facing moments of fear and worry, whenever you're feeling overwhelmed, maybe you're just feeling like a grasshopper that's going to get squashed today, that you remember God is with you and nothing is impossible with him.